My name is Jane Lyder. I live in Bethesda, Maryland. I was born in Yonkers, New York. My parents were both born in New York City. My family is Irish on both sides. I grew up with my mother's family, who were Devines and Arthurs, and my grandmother was born in New York City on my mother's side, as were her parents, but her mother was ill in 1904, pregnant with her third child, and her father took the family to Ireland, to Galway, where my great-grandmother had her third child and then died of TB 4 months later. My great-grandfather left my grandmother and her brother and her new infant sister with relatives in East Galway, where they lived for 10 years until he came and brought them back. So I knew on my mother's side that I was very Irish. I grew up in an apartment building and my grandparents lived across the hall, and my grandmother would tell me stories about her time in Ireland. And my grandfather's family supposedly the Devines came during the famine in the 1840s. They settled in Albany, New York. I was told a story that one of my great uncles established the first hotel in Albany, and he was called the Potato King. I'm not sure I believe much of that, because it's hard to think the first hotel was in the 1840s. But I was very proud of that. I did projects on Ireland. I did projects on the ferries of Ireland, because my grandmother talked a lot about that. But I didn't know much about my father's family. My surname is Lyder, which is not Irish, and I was told that it was English, and my father was raised in an orphanage because his mother died when he was 6 years old, and he was the oldest of 4 children. When my father died in 1999, I looked through his papers and I found his birth certificate, and I saw that his mother's name was Anne Farrell, and she was born in Roscommon. I didn't have any connection to Roscommon. I didn't know anybody in Ireland, but I became curious about her, and I went online and I went onto a blog site of people looking for their Irish relatives, and I had found a paper in my father's belongings listing relatives of my grandmother's brother who had died, and they were in High Lake, Roscommon, Nicholas Farrell. And so I asked if anyone knew of a Nicholas Farrell in High Lake, Roscommon, and somebody answered me and said yes, they were neighbors and they would put me in touch. So I actually got in touch with my grandmother's family, and in 2006 my husband and I went to Ireland, and I met my father's first cousin, and they lived outside of the city of Roscommon, in the countryside, on land that my great-grandfather was a sheep herder. And during when land was distributed in the 1920s, he was given land that my relatives are actually still living on. But there were so many children that my grandmother and her sisters and 2 brothers left Ireland and came to the United States, and so that's why, but her 2 older brothers stayed. So we went to Roscommon, and I had a relative, I had a great aunt who was a nun in New York, and my father's cousin had met the nun, and so we sat in her little house in front of her peat stove. It was December 28th, and it was dark and it was cold, and we talked about this, and we talked about my grandmother and how she died, and the stories they had heard and the stories I had heard. We went back to Ireland in 2014 or 15, I believe, and Margaret, my father's cousin, had died by then, but we went and met again with her children, who are my age and still live in Roscommon, and had a wonderful time at Gleason's restaurant, bar, and inn where we stayed. And we went to the Strokestown Famine Museum. which was very moving and very difficult because over time I learned that almost all of my Irish relatives on both my mother's side and clearly my grandmother had roots in Roscommon or East Galway, and the description of what happened in Roscommon, what happened during the famine, rolling bodies of people out of the upper stories so they could be buried in mass, people being put on ships when they were ill with the knowledge that they most likely would not make the voyage, was disturbing. I knew much of it, but the museum really brought it home to me. So I came back and I then actually did Ancestry.com and found I was 86% Irish. And it turned out even from my grandfather, who was born in Barbados, whose family went back to the 1600s in Barbados, I was Irish in that line as well. And so I'm very much the child of immigrants. I'm very proud to be Irish. I went to Fordham University. I think it's a wonderful culture to be associated with, and I am happy that you are doing this project.